let me quote to you from one of Israel's really impressive reporters and human beings, just a genuinely decent fellow, not to mention a first-rate reporter, a fellow named Gideon Levy, who covers the occupied territories for Israel's most influential newspaper, Haaretz. And he says as follows. He was describing one of these indiscriminate shellings of the town of Beit Hanun in Gaza. And he says as follows. Someone who throws burning matches into a forest can't claim he didn't mean to set it on fire. And anyone who bombards residential neighborhoods with artillery can't claim he didn't mean to kill innocent civilians. Therefore, says Mr. Levy, it takes considerable gall and cynicism to dare to claim that the Israel Defense Forces did not intend to kill inhabitants of Beit Hanun. And it's very interesting to read that because you see how a good reporter translates an abstract legal principle, which was boring these two young men to tears, translates it into a simple concept which everyone understands. He says, if you bombard residential neighborhoods with artillery, it takes considerable gall to claim you didn't intend to kill them. It's intentional. It's no different than a Hamas suicide bombing. That's also the opinion of Israel's most distinguished authority in international law, a fellow named Yoram Dinstein. He's the president of Tel Aviv University, a very smart fellow. Unfortunately, when he writes on Isreal and Palestine, he's dreadful. But as a legal mind, everyone agrees he's first rate. He's very solid. And he's written some of the standard books on the laws of war. And in one of those books, he writes, quote, there is no genuine difference between a premeditated attack against civilians, which is what Hamas is accused of, premeditated attacks on civilians, and the reckless use of force, which is what Israel is accused of by human rights organizations. And he writes, they are equally forbidden. There is no distinction between the indiscriminate shelling of civilians and the suicide bombings aimed at civilians. So where does that leave us after that long analysis of several levels? The only differences between Israeli and Hamas terrorism are, one, Israeli terrorism is about 4 times as deadly as Hamas terrorism, and two, no demand, let alone sanctions, have been imposed on Israel to renounce terrorism. Well, their terrorism is about 4 or 5 times as deadly as Hamas terrorism. No demand has been put on Israel to stop its terrorism. No sanctions have been put on Israel. Then that's called a double standard. That's hypocrisy. It can't be called a legal or a moral standard. Some of you who are willing to go with me this far, and I suspect there is a considerable minority who left me a long time ago, but those of you who are willing to go with me this far may say, okay, maybe what you're saying about the history is right, and maybe what you're saying about the human rights record is true. But it's very hard to fathom, to believe that resolving the conflict is not controversial, is not complicated. That seems highly implausible. After all, were it easy to resolve, how then would one explain that it's been going on for 4 decades now, the occupation? Twice the period of time of the students in this room how long they've been on the planet Earth. Most students here about the age cohort of around 20. And if you're a student and you go through your life and you have that first or second birthday party, first day of kindergarten, second grade teacher who you had a crush on, junior high school when your hormones started to explode, and the various events that accompany that, bar mitzvah, bas mitzvah, coming out party, high school, graduation, college, you take your whole life and then you double it. And that's what the Palestinians have had to endure, 40 years. It's a long time. And it's very hard to believe intellectually, and morally, it's a very heavy burden to believe this is not a complicated conflict and could have been resolved a long time ago with a lot fewer tears shed and a lot fewer joyless days for the people under occupation. But that's what the record shows. I've tried throughout this evening's remarks to stick strictly to what the record shows, not my opinion. So let's look at what the record shows. Everybody here can check for him or herself whether what I'm saying is true. It's very easy. All you have to do is Google the words peaceful settlement of Palestine question. Peaceful settlement of Palestine question. And if you Google those words, what will come up on your screen is the UN record, the General Assembly record, on how to resolve the conflict. Now, everybody in this room knows the basic formula for resolving the conflict. It's called, you all know, the two-state settlement, namely a full Israeli withdrawal from the territories it occupied in June 1967. In accordance with that principle, it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. And then there's a second fundamental principle of international law, Article 2 of the UN Charter. It says that all member states of the United Nations have the right to exist free from threats or use of force. So, all the neighboring Arab states and the new Palestinian state have to renounce any threats or use of force against Israel or Israel's right to live in peace with its neighbors. And then the third principle, which I'll get to presently, is the question of what the international community calls a just settlement of the refugee question. That's the formula. So let's look at what it looks like in the international community. Every year, around November or December, it's voted on in the United Nations General Assembly. That formula, the resolution is called Peaceful Settlement of the Palestine Question. What does the vote look like? 1989, the vote was 151 to 3. The three negative votes were the United States, Israel, and the island state of Dominica. That was it. Now, let's just look quickly at the last 10 years. What is the vote? 1997, 155 to 2, US and Israel. 1998, 154 to 2, US and Israel. 2002, 160 to 4, 2003, 160 to 6, 2004, 161 to 7. This past year, 161 to 7. Now, some of you in this room are mathematicians. I know we have a distinguished physicist sitting in the audience. So some of you will have noticed that the number of negative votes leaped from 2 to a colossal 7. And that's true. Far be it for us to exaggerate, misrepresent, or falsify the record. And the 7 every year is always the same. It's always the United States, Israel, Nauru, N-A-U-R-U, Palau, P-A-L-A-U, Tuvalu, T-U-V-A-L-U, the Federated States of Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands. Once in a while, another country goes in and out, but that's it. Now, some of you are wondering what are Nauru, Palau, and Tuvalu. Those two gentlemen who were getting exasperated with me now have a nervous laugh because they want to join the humor, but they don't know what those places are. And actually, with all due, to be candid about these things, although technically I taught this subject, I had never heard of them. It turns out that they are South Sea Island atolls. We're islands, and we want to be politically correct, but we can still nonetheless acknowledge as an objective fact that their total populations could fit in the empty space in this room. And that's it. That is literally it. If you look at the simple numbers each year, there is no controversy whatsoever about how to resolve this conflict, if for no other reason that it doesn't raise any particularly complicated questions of international law. It's hard to believe that the same obstacle has endured for fully 4 decades. You take 1970, there was a very distinguished professor of international law. His name is Quincy Wright, he's since passed from the scene. And he wrote in 1970, in view of the acceptance of the Resolution 242, the main resolution on the Israel-Arab conflict, by the adjacent Arab states except Syria, the major obstacle to progress seems to be the refusal of Israel to do so and to agree to withdraw from occupied territories. That's 1970. The major obstacle is Israel's refusal to withdraw from occupied territories. You fast forward 40 years later, Jimmy Carter, his book, Peace Not Apartheid, Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid. What does he conclude? Peace will come to Israel and the Middle East only when Israel is willing to comply with international law by accepting its legal borders. Almost word for word what Quincy Wright wrote 40 years ago. That's been the obstacle. Okay, now let's return to the conflict itself. January 2006, Hamas is elected into power. These brutal sanctions are imposed on the Palestinian people. Hamas has to renounce terrorism. And number 2, Hamas has to recognize Israel. Well, again, to me, at any rate, that's a no-brainer. Under international law, every member state of the United Nations has the right to exist free from threats or use of force. The Arab states are obliged to recognize Israel. Hamas is also. Hamas's record for the past 2 years has been pretty clear. You can't say it lacks any ambiguity, but their position since 2006 is they accept a settlement on the June 1967 border, or at any rate they accept if the Palestinian people in a referendum vote for a settlement on the 1967 border, they will accept it. At the most, you can say, and I'm willing to concede, no point in being stubborn about these things, you can say that sometimes Hamas's position has been ambiguous. They go hot and cold on the question. Sometimes their leadership says we accept 67, and sometimes you could say occasionally they have retreated in the past couple of years. So at best you can say, or at worst, Hamas's record has been ambiguous. But then what has been Israel's record? Not a single Israeli government, not a single Israeli political party, not a single Israeli leading official has ever accepted a two-state settlement on the June 1967 border, what the United Nations General Assembly, what the International Court of Justice have said. Occupied Palestinian territories, a full withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza, with East Jerusalem as the capital of the Palestinian state. No Israeli government has ever said that. In fact, while as the world demands that Hamas recognize Israel, what is Israel doing? Not in words, but in deed. Not in words, but in deed. They're annexing illegally about 10 to 13% of the West Bank by building the wall. They have illegally annexed East Jerusalem. They have illegally de facto annexed the Jordan Valley. They have fragmented the West Bank into 6 pieces, surrounded by Jewish settlements. As Haaretz, Israel's most influential paper, said, the Palestinians have no territory left on which to establish a state. Now, again, you accept the principle that all states have the right to exist free from threat or use of force. But then you have to ask yourself, which side is the major violator of that principle? And which side is having to bear the burden of all of these sanctions? The worst that can be said about Hamas is that its position has been on occasion ambiguous. And they are now, or the Palestinian people now, are being subjected to these brutal sanctions. And the Israeli side, nobody in the Israeli side has accepted a two-state settlement on the June 67 border. No demands put on Israel, no sanctions on Israel. That's just pure hypocrisy. It's a double standard. Okay, that to me, and we'll have time to discuss it, we allotted plenty of time, believe me. That to me is the historical human rights diplomatic record, as I understand it, obviously skimming it. And now the question arises, obviously, if the record is as unambiguous as I claim it is, as I allege it is, if it's as unambiguous as I claim, then where does all the controversy come from? And my own view is the preponderance of the controversy, not all of it, but the preponderance of the controversy is contrived, it's artificial, it's fake. Its purpose is to divert attention from the record that I have just gone over with you in this room, to deflect attention from it, to sow confusion about it. There is, however, in my view, one aspect of the controversy which actually is, I think, legitimate. It's an honest difference of opinion, and that's the question of the refugees. As I said earlier, there is really no dispute or debate any longer, serious dispute or debate, that the Palestinians were ethnically cleansed in 1948. Some people dispute whether or not that was immoral, what happened. You take the case of that historian Benny Morris, who's the main historian on the refugees. He says, yes, the Palestinians were ethnically cleansed in 1948, but he says, I think it was a good thing. He says, sometimes ethnic cleansings are good things. He says, take the case of North America. Were it not for, and now I'm quoting him, I'm quoting Mr. Morris, were it not for the annihilation, his word, not mine, of the native population, he said you couldn't have had the great American Republic. And so sometimes ethnic cleansings are good things. It's the same position of Professor Dershowitz at Harvard, who called ethnic cleansings, and now I'm quoting him, a fifth-rate human rights issue analogous to massive urban renewal. Okay, so it's not a question of disputing what happened, it's a different moral judgment. And you can't really say moral judgments are wrong in the same way as you can say facts are wrong. You could say it's a Nazi moral judgment, and I'll go with you there, but I don't think you can say it's a wrong moral judgment. If you leave people like Mr. Morris and Mr. Dershowitz on the side, and you return to the moral universe of most normal human beings, you still have problems. Because you can agree on the facts, you can agree in your moral judgment, you can agree in your legal judgment, but still disagree in your political judgment. Now that's a little bit tougher because most of us like to think our politics come from our morals or from our sense of law. But it's not necessarily so. So I'll give you an example. Take the case of Professor Chomsky. The Palestinians, of course, because the record shows it, he agrees they were ethnically cleansed. That it was immoral, well, for most normal human beings, ethnic cleansings are an abomination. No point in detaining us on that. And legally, of course, the Palestinians have legally the right of return. That too, I would want to emphasize, is not at all controversial under international law. You go look at 2000, 2001, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, they both put out opinion papers on the right of return of the Palestinians. Now, Amnesty and Human Rights Watch are hardly radical organizations, but they both say explicitly, unambiguously, and unequivocally, the Palestinians who were expelled and all succeeding generations which have what they call genuine links to the land, that's the human rights terminology, have the right of return. That is not a controversial question. Where it does become a problem is, well, Professor Chomsky is of the opinion, he says, I don't think it's going to happen. As a political reality, it's not going to happen. And therefore, he says, in my opinion, speaking for him, he says, it's immoral to tell people they're going to be returning when you know they're not. Now, my own view on the subject is, I think that's a legitimate difference among honest people. Political judgments are just that. You have to weigh 1,000 different factors in order to come to a conclusion about whether or not something is feasible. If after weighing the 1,000 different factors, you reach the conclusion it's not feasible politically, then I think Professor Chomsky is right. It is immoral to raise unrealistic hopes among those who are suffering. If, however, weighing the 10,000 factors, you reach the conclusion it is feasible, then I think it's perfectly moral to advocate the right of return. I think honest people can agree to disagree on that particular question. Now, some of you may be thinking, I don't quite get what he's saying, because he's saying they have the right to return, but then he's saying, but I don't think they can return. And that doesn't sound right. How many people think there's a little bit of a contradiction there between those statements? Raise your hand. Okay, fair enough. And I'll acknowledge I had trouble with that for a long time. There seemed to be almost a word game going on there. But then last year, and I'm just using this as an illustration of a principle I'm not talking about comparative suffering. I'm just as a principle. Last year, I had an experience some of you are familiar with where I was denied tenure from my university. And I was confident, and my lawyer was very confident, had we gone to court, had we adjudicated the case, I had a very strong case, and I would win my right to return to the pool. Well, but my lawyer said to me, do you really want to do that? Do you want to invest the next 6 years of your life, which is how long tenure cases usually take, 4 to 6 years, do you want to spend 6 years in court battling this out? The rest of your life comes to full stop. All your energy is invested spending it at night, working on briefs, going over this case again and again. Do you really want to do that? Or do you want to aim for a settlement? And my view was, even though I was very confident that I could win my right of return, I chose a settlement. And choosing a settlement does not mean you're acknowledging you don't have the right of return. You're simply saying, as a practical matter, I'm going to opt out of that interminable and ugly struggle and find some sort of settlement and move on with my life. Now, as a principle, I think that also applies to the question of the Palestinian refugees, to aim for a settlement. If they choose it, nobody's telling them. It's their right. If they want to fight it out, it's their right. And none of us, in my opinion, has the right to tell them not to fight it out. That's their right. I went through many experiences in universities. I remember one where in 1992, I was asked to leave one of my universities. Students were upset. They went to another faculty member who was the radical faculty member, Steve London. And Steve said, well, I think Finkelstein would be happier somewhere else. And I thought to myself, but wait, I think that's a decision I should be making, not Steve. His obligation is to support my right. And I think the same principle applies to the Palestinians. However, if Israel does not want to fulfill that right, then it has to make a settlement offer which the Palestinians will accept in lieu of the right. In my own case, the settlement offer consisted of basically two components. One, there had to be a public acknowledgement of the wrong that had been done me, because my name had been dragged through the mud for several years, culminating in last year. And the university at the end issued a public statement which said that I was an outstanding teacher and a prolific scholar. They had to do that. In the case of the Palestinians, a minimum condition for settling the refugee question has to be a public acknowledgement of the wrong that was done them. The official Israeli position is, as stated by Ehud Barak and others, that we, meaning Israel, will not accept any historic, legal, moral, or political responsibility for what happened to the Palestinians in 1948. To my thinking, that's a non-starter. That's as if DePaul University were to say, we won't acknowledge Finkelstein's record over the past 6 years. You won't acknowledge it, then we're going to court. No, you have to acknowledge it. And there has to be an acknowledgement by Israel of the colossal wrong it inflicted on the Palestinians in 1948. And the second component, as you all know, is the material component. There has to be some sort of compensation for what was done. I think that is, I'm not recommending it, because I've had, as I've already told you, too much experience with people recommending to me what's best for me. I'm not recommending it. On the other hand, I do believe it's a realistic way of settling the problem if, as Professor Chomsky says, it's infeasible, its implementation. If, I think that's a reasonable way, bearing in mind two things. Number one, There is no question under international law the Palestinian people have, or refugees, have the right of return. And number two, the overarching framework for resolving the conflict is not complicated, it's not controversial, and the only obstacle has been Israel's refusal, backed by the United States, as Jimmy Carter put it, to withdraw to its legal borders, the June 1967 borders. I'm going to try to wrap up. I'll look at just one particular issue on how this confusion about the conflict is sown and how people are deflected from the real heart of the conflict by totally irrelevant issues. And the most commonplace one is the dragging in of the Nazi Holocaust, the playing of the Holocaust card. That really begins only around after 1967. Time doesn't allow me to go through it. Just give me 1/2 moment. Time doesn't allow me to go through it here. The Nazi Holocaust played a pretty trivial aspect in American Jewish life and American life generally until June 1967. After 67, it becomes a very prominent feature of American Jewish life and American life generally. The main contribution of this Holocaust phenomenon that begins after 67 is this claim of Holocaust uniqueness, which I suspect many of you in this room are familiar with, this doctrine that no people in the world has ever suffered as much as Jews suffered during the Nazi Holocaust. And there's actually a scholarly literature which can fill several good-sized bookshelves just devoted to that topic, trying to prove the uniqueness of the Nazi Holocaust. There's no intellectual basis for that claim. It's completely vacuous, this doctrine of Holocaust uniqueness. And as a moral doctrine, it's obviously an abomination. This idea of trying to rank human suffering and somehow prove that a child in Vietnam who has been napalmed has suffered less than a child who has been thrown into a gas chamber. The very idea of trying to do that, in my opinion, is pathological. And anyhow, why would anyone even want to go there, of trying to rank human suffering? If the doctrine has no intellectual content, and morally it's an abomination, politically it served a very useful purpose. Because if you can prove that people suffered uniquely, then you can make the case that they shouldn't be held to the same moral and legal standards as everyone else. So if it's true, and it is, that Israel is the only country in the world which legalized torture, well then we're told, remember the Holocaust. And if it's true, and it is, that Israel is the only country in the world which legalized house demolitions as a form of punishment, well then we're told, remember the Holocaust. And if it's true, and it is, that Israel is the only country in the world which legalized hostage taking, or as the High Court put it, the taking of bargaining chips, well then we're told, remember the Holocaust. And all of these egregious violations of human rights are then justified in the name of the Nazi Holocaust. There was also another unique contribution Israel made just recently. In July, August 2006, Israel dropped the most cluster bombs in a given area in the history of the world. Believe it or not, and it is kind of almost science fiction in its nature, the last 3 days of the war, when a UN resolution had already been agreed on for a ceasefire in Lebanon, and the only issue now was its implementation on the ground, Israel dropped 4.6 million cluster bomblets all over the south of Lebanon. It was the densest use of cluster bombs in the history of the world. We, the United States, dropped 20 million during the first Iraq War, but it was over an area which was 20 times the size. So that was another, apart from the house demolitions, the torture, and the hostage taking, this was another contribution. The other peculiar characteristic of this use of the Nazi Holocaust is that historically it's always used to demonize Israel's enemies. We're told that the Arabs are either the perpetrators of the final solution, or the lineal descendants of the Nazis. So you take, for example, 1948, David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, he refers to the Arabs as being, quote, the disciples and even teachers of Hitler, who know only one way of solving the Jewish problem, total destruction. During the Eichmann trial, we were told the Palestinian Mufti of Jerusalem, who was a nasty person, no question about it, we were told he was among the biggest Nazi war criminals and the real mastermind of the final solution. During the 1950s, we were told that Mr. Nasser of Egypt, he was Hitler. 2001, we were told, you will recall, Saddam is Hitler. I should say 1991, it was Saddam who was Hitler. 2003, it was Saddam again who was Hitler. Now if you read it's the journals, the opinion journals, Hamas is Hitler, Hezbollah is Hitler, Ahmadinejad is Hitler, everybody is Hitler. And you have this peculiar phenomenon. On the one hand, we're told never to compare what happened to the Jews during World War II with any other event. And if you compare it, you're called a Holocaust minimizer and a denier of the Holocaust. But then, after saying we shouldn't compare, they compare everyone to Hitler and threatening a new Holocaust. Hamas is Hitler, Hezbollah is Hitler, Iran is Hitler, and if you oppose any of these wars being waged, we're told you're appeasers of Hitler. You are the new Neville Chamberlains. And it's become a kind of sad irony, I think, that the chief ideological weapon in the world today to mobilize for wars of aggression, the chief ideological weapon in the world today to mobilize for wars of aggression has become the Nazi Holocaust. The enemy is always Hitler, always threatening a new Holocaust, and if you opposed the war in 2003, or you're opposing now an attack on Iraq, you're said to be a new appeaser, just like the appeasers of Hitler in 1938. The most recent version of this claim of the Holocaust industry card is what's called the new anti-Semitism. I'm sure all of you have heard of it. Begins around 2001, this hysteria that there's a new anti-Semitism running amok in the world. It's rampant, rife. A new Holocaust is on the horizon. There are two things to be said about this new anti-Semitism. Number one, it's not new. And number two, it has nothing at all to do with anti-Semitism. How do we know that? It's simple. Go to your library. I understand you have actually a quite beautiful library. And enter under the subject heading in the catalog, enter new anti-Semitism. And what will come up if you enter those words are a book written not this year or last year, but 1974 by the heads of the main Jewish so-called defense organization, the Anti-Defamation League. What's it called? The New Anti-Semitism. 1982, another book put out by the ADL. What's it called? The Real Anti-Semitism. What's its thesis? That there's a new anti-Semitism. And every time Israel faces a major public relations debacle, as it did in 2000 due to its repression of the Second Intifada, or a lot of pressure is put on Israel to resolve the conflict diplomatically, the claim comes of a new anti-Semitism. In the case of this most recent claim, people in this room are actually very qualified to judge for themselves how accurate it is. Because if you read the literature, they say that the main core, the core of this new anti-Semitism is the college campuses. The college campuses are rampant, rife with this new anti-Semitism. We're told that some places like San Francisco State University, there are pogroms being committed against Jews, attacks on Jews. I have to say I entered this particular topic with a certain amount of skepticism. It happens. I've taught at many universities. I've been around the block several times. I may have been around my last block. And the one thing you could say about college campuses is they are so politically correct. It's impossible to be anti-anything on a college campus. You obviously can't be anti-black, anti-Puerto Rican, anti-woman, anti-Latino, anti-gay, anti-tool, anti-short, anti-fat, anti-skinny. You know, you can't be anti-downright aesthetically challenged. That is ugly. No, you can't do it. So it was kind of odd having this experience to be told that amidst all of this often stifling and suffocating political correctness, that there is rampant, rife anti-Semitism. That didn't seem very plausible. And, you know, I looked into it for a book I was writing, couldn't find any evidence of it. Of course, some of you are thinking, of course, Finkelstein couldn't find the evidence because he wasn't looking for it. But then you open up the Chronicle of Higher Education, which is the main in-house publication for professors. And they have an article this past summer. It's called, "It's a Good Time to Be a Jewish Student at an American College." The head of Hillel, the main Jewish campus organization, says, "It's a golden age of Jewishness on college campuses." The head of AIPAC, the main Israel lobbying group, says, quote, "It's a glorious time, not only for Jewish student life on campuses, but for the pro-Israel student movement as well," which is what any rational person seeing what's going on college campuses would conclude. You go on a college campus nowadays, they have a Judaic studies program, a Holocaust studies program, an Israel studies program, an anti-Semitism studies program. The only thing they don't have is a special degree program in Jewish naval contemplation. So how can you talk about anti-Semitism being rife on college campuses? It's not believable. Or some of you are thinking, what about Europe? Isn't there a new Hitlerite anti-Semitism in Europe? They say France, Germany. Well, I looked into it, couldn't find any evidence. Again, I'm perhaps biased. But then you open up the world's leading Zionist historian, a fellow named Walter Laqueur. He puts out a book a couple of summers ago called The Changing Face of Anti-Semitism. What does he find about Europe? Quote, "Popular attitudes towards Jews in Europe are in fact slightly more favorable in 2002 than they had been in 1991. Not only is there no evidence of a new anti-Semitism in Europe, the situation there now for Jews is better than it's ever been," which again, any rational person would conclude. Because if that's not your conclusion, if you really believe that Europe is on the verge of a new Hitlerite anti-Semitism, you're forced to reach perplexing conclusions. For example, the papers report that 3/4 of Israelis want to be in the European Union, and 1/10 would actually leave Israel for Europe if they were granted EU citizenship. Well, if it's true that Europe is on the verge of a new Hitlerite anti-Semitism, that would mean that 3/4 of Israelis want Israel to ally with Nazis. And 1 in every 10 Israelis, those who want to immigrate to Europe, 1 in every 10 wants to be exterminated. Does that make any sense? No, because the premise is preposterous, that there is a rampant new anti-Semitism in Europe for which there isn't a scratch of evidence. Well, so what's the purpose of all of these claims about a new anti-Semitism? The purpose is pretty straightforward. You saw it in the case of Jimmy Carter, and I promise that's where I'll leave off. What happened? The first purpose of this claim of a new anti-Semitism is, first of all, to turn the perpetrator into the victim, to claim that we should now be concerning ourselves with the alleged suffering of Israel and its supporters, and not the very real suffering of the Palestinians. And the second purpose of this claim of a new anti-Semitism is obviously to discredit any critic of Israel as being motivated by anti-Semitism. And we saw that in quite vivid form, as I said a moment ago, in the case of Jimmy Carter. He comes out with a book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. What happens? Immediately as the book is published, a fellow named Kenneth Stein, a professor at Emory University, says, Jimmy Carter is a plagiarist. Then Professor Dershowitz says that Jimmy Carter is in the pay of Arab sheikhs. Then we're told Jimmy Carter is an anti-Semite. Then we're told by Deborah Lipstadt in the Washington Post that Jimmy Carter is a borderline Holocaust denier. Then we're told by Neil Scher that Jimmy Carter is a Nazi sympathizer. And then we were told that Jimmy Carter was a supporter of Arab terrorism. Those are not my rendering of the charges. Those are the literal rendering of the charges. And it all worked like a charm. Because what happened? Read the reviews of the book. Read the coverage. Nobody ever talked about what was in Jimmy Carter's book. The only discussion was, is Jimmy Carter an anti-Semite? Is Jimmy Carter a Holocaust denier? Is Jimmy Carter in the pay of Arab sheikhs? Did Jimmy Carter plagiarize in his book? Nobody talked about the content of the book. It's not a great book. I wouldn't pretend to that claim. But there's some of it that's quite solid. Chapter 16, titled The Wall as a Prison, when he describes what that wall is doing to places like Bethlehem, which are important to him as a Christian, how they have systematically wrecked and destroyed the city of Bethlehem, which they have. They've built that hideous wall right outside the main street in Bethlehem and destroyed it. Now, I would suppose if you were to go and Google the wall as a prison in Google, the only website that will come up is my own. It wasn't discussed anywhere. Neither were his conclusions, the ones I mentioned earlier. What's the main obstacle to peace? Israel's refusal to withdraw to its legal borders. And that's the point of all of this artificial, fake controversy, the dragging in of the Nazi Holocaust, the claims of a new anti-Semitism, to divert a people's attention from the documentary record to sow confusion about what that record shows. That's a pretty not uplifting way to end, but I think there's actually lots of reason for optimism. And you can look at it in the case of Mr. Carter. They tried to slander him. All these ad hominem attacks on him tried to discredit him. But nonetheless, the book ended up #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. It sold 300,000 copies in hardback. Mr. Carter then said at some point, I want to go into the lion's den. I want to go speak at Brandeis, which is the largest secular Jewish university in the United States. He goes to Brandeis University. 2,000 students turn out in the gymnasium. It was close to the community. 2,000 students turn out, overwhelmingly Jewish. Mr. Carter gets 4 standing ovations. Then Mr. Dershowitz is going to deliver, or assigned himself to deliver, the reply. When he got up to speak, the newspapers reported that about 2/3 of the audience just walked out before he began. And I think it's an instructive lesson for all of us. #1, stick to the facts. There's no need to exaggerate. There's certainly no need to misrepresent. Stick strictly to the factual record. And #2, to show a little courage. We're not talking about the kind of courage that most people in the world have to show to win their most elementary basic rights. We don't have our limbs cut off here. Apart from a small, relatively small, targeted group, which face real problems, people like Dr. Sami El-Arian, apart from a small, targeted group, we're only asked to make the most minimal sacrifices here for speaking the truth. Show a little, stick to the facts, show a little courage, a little backbone. And I think we have on our side the 2 most powerful weapons there are. I'm a person of the left, and I still believe in those values. A lot of values I've had to give up. But 2 values I still believe, I still remain confident, and I suspect I will till my last breath, that we have 2 powerful weapons. It's those old-fashioned weapons of truth and justice. If we learn how to wield those weapons, stick to the truth, learn the facts, go to those human rights reports and see what they say, and apply a basic, elementary principle of justice. Stick to the truth, apply a principle of justice. If we learn how to wield those weapons, I think that however much money the other side has, and they have a lot, and however ruthless they are, and they are ruthless, and however powerful they are, and they are powerful, I still am convinced, and more convinced each day, that if we learn to wield those weapons of truth and justice, we can win. And when I say we can win, I am not saying at anyone's expense. The late Edward Said, he used to like to quote the phrase of another, I think it was the African writer Aimé Césaire, the line that says, there's a place for everyone at the rendezvous with victory. It's not a victory at anyone's expense. It's a victory which means mutual respect, the mutual right of everyone to live with honor, live with dignity, and have the same shot at life's happiness. That's what we're aiming for. If we learn to use those weapons of truth and justice, I think that victory is within reach. Thank you. have 50 minutes. That's plenty of time. And the audience, as always, was remarkably respectful and decent. And so, since you had to endure me for a lengthy period of time, I like to take dissenters first, because you were polite in listening to me. I suspect some of you found me a little bit exasperating. So let the dissenters speak first. Let's take the first 3 questions from those who want to register a dissent.
Coming from the child of Holocaust survivors, and on that note, I'd like to...
Here's your anger. Congratulations.
Finkelstein, thank you for this evening. I just want to mention, I think that these people are angry because you shed some light on the confusion that they were enjoying throughout these, since 48. All of the issues regarding Israel and Palestinian has always been in favor of Israelis. And you mentioned is wine and cheese. They are very familiar with that atmosphere. Now you shed some light, of course they will flee. But nonetheless, I want to mention something, because now the pendulum is swinging in favor of Palestinian for the first time, and I would add, thank God. But I just want to take this opportunity and again mention the blood of Palestinian is the only tools, one might say the only tools that is in favor of this changing atmosphere. And for that reason, I would be proud to call myself, for the cause of Palestinian, for the support of them, one of them. And for that matter, I hope one day, we would get to the point that we all can resolve this, as you mentioned, one place at the table, equal. Every of us had a table, and I think that was Noam Chomsky's point when he was talking about right of the return of refugees. The door should be left open. Those who want to come and who choose to stay. But thank you for this evening.